Thank you. The chair recognizes the gentleman from Rhode Island.
Thank you, Director Wray, for your service to our country, and thank you to the men and women of the FBI. Gun violence is an epidemic in our country. In my home state of Rhode Island last month, a 31-year-old man was shot at a park while playing with his son. A teenage woman was killed while sitting in a car. A 20-year-old man was shot to death outside of his home. And the same thing is happening in cities all across America. And there's no question that this problem has gotten worse during the COVID-19 pandemic. In 2020, Rhode Island saw a significant increase in gun sales, and during that same time, we saw an 87% increase in gun-related deaths. And that trend has continued into 2021. And so I hope that you can shed some light on what the FBI can do and how Congress can support the agency to fight an epidemic that will claim 40,000 American lives this year. And so specifically, as I discussed, gun rails skyrocketed during the COVID-19 pandemic. Nearly 23 million firearms were purchased nationwide in 2020, a 64% increase. And for each of these sales, a background check is required, putting tremendous pressure on our background check system. And in fact, in March of last year, the start of the pandemic, federal background checks hit a 1 million in a week mark. And so what does that increase in gun sales mean for the background check system and for public safety, and particularly with respect to your ability to complete a background check within 3 days as required by the statute?
So, Congressman, I appreciate the question for a number of reasons, not the least of which is our folks at NICS, the background check systems, have worked incredibly hard this past year in particular, right through the teeth of the pandemic, and had to be very creative in terms of how we kept people socially distanced, rotating shifts, et cetera. We lived in fear that we would suddenly lose the ability to be able to continue to process the checks because we could potentially wipe out, in terms of having to quarantine an entire room full of cubicles of people. We processed last year 40...
Yeah, my question, I guess, is would additional resources be helpful in order to keep up with this pace so that we don't have the 3-day period passing before the background check can be completed?
Absolutely. We have been having to do overtime. We've been having to pull people from other key missions to staff it. I am very proud of the fact that even though we did a record, you used 23 million, my information is that we processed 40 million firearms background checks last year, and then we were able to complete about 96% of those within the 3 days, despite that record, despite the pandemic.
Thank you, Director. So in 2018, the Center for American Progress, and according to FBI data as well, almost 4,000 prohibited purchasers were able to get a gun because the background check for their sale was not completed within 3 days. This is the loophole that allowed the Charleston shooter, who legally should have never been allowed to purchase a firearm, to buy a gun and use it to murder 9 worshipers in a church. So my question is, how is the FBI supporting the ATF's recovery of firearms found to be transferred to a prohibited purchaser? Are you giving specific instructions nationwide to ATF offices on how to do this? Are those practices being formalized? Because my experience is they're supposed to be recovered by ATF, but it doesn't seem like that happens. This is individuals who got a gun from a gun store who are legally prohibited from owning it. And I've actually introduced a bill, the Unlawful Gun Buyer Alert, that would require local law enforcement be notified if firearms are delivered to a prohibited purchaser, and wonder whether you think that would also be helpful in making jurisdictions aware when someone has illegally purchased a gun. But I'm really interested to know what you're doing with your field offices with ATF in this recovery, and how we can at least take on this issue of people getting guns from a gun store who don't pass a background check.
I think it might be better for me to offer to have my staff provide you more information about the details of how we work with ATF. They have a very, very tough job, as you alluded to, in recovering the guns that are sold to people who are prohibited by law from having them.
Maybe a briefing on that, Director, because that'd be very helpful.
We'd be happy to set up a briefing on that subject.
And my last question, Director, is since September 11th, the FBI has provided tens of millions of dollars of counterterrorism training and resources to state and local law enforcement agencies. How is the FBI reallocating this support to state and local partners to address the rise of white supremacists and anti-government groups And is the Bureau also giving guidance to the Joint Terrorism Task Force to address white supremacist extremism?
So a couple things there. One is we absolutely are providing domestic terrorism training to state and local partners, and we've actually recently been providing some of our more advanced training to the state and local officers, of whom there are hundreds and hundreds and hundreds who are task force officers on our joint terrorism task forces. As to the prioritization of the joint terrorism task forces on domestic terrorism and specifically racially motivated violent extremism, when I elevated that to our highest priority level back in summer of 2019, the effect of that was to make sure that not only that all 56 field officers are collecting intelligence and disseminating it on that subject, but also to make sure that all 200 plus joint terrorism task forces and the 4,500 or 5,000, whatever it is, investigators that are on them have domestic terrorism, and specifically that part of domestic terrorism squarely within their sights.
The gentleman's time is expired.